Hello and welcome. I am here today with Bryan Coley, founder of Real Experiences and writer-director. And Bryan, we're talking about the Oscars today.
We always do every year, right?
Every year. We seem to be the two people outside of Los Angeles who seem really interested in this kind of stuff.
There is very few people who are interested in the Oscars, right? These days. It seems like it's not very relevant. But we try to make it relevant by showing that actually maybe even God cares about the Oscars, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I'm really interested to dive into that. But before we even get there, I just want to say, Bryan, I'm really glad to be here today. Really glad to get to talk about the Oscars with you. Anytime I get together with you, we get to talk about movies, and that's kind of my happy place. So just really glad to be here. And for people who are just joining us here today for the first time, talk a little bit about what Real Experiences is and a little bit how that relates to the Oscars.
Yeah, so we've been working over 10 years now looking at people's favorite movies and the way that their favorite movies actually tells their story. So we unpack that for teams, specifically a lot of corporate teams that we do, but we've been doing it for families and married people, and we've just seen the power and surprise of seeing this palette of films, and you take it as a palette. You're not asking like, what's your favorite movie? You're asking, what are your favorite movies? And then you're looking inside their favorite movies with different, we call them lenses, to be able to go, okay, well, let's look at the lens of character. Let's look at the lens of desire, those kinds of lenses. And then all of a sudden, just this crazy stuff starts coming out. And so once we did that on a personal level, I said, well, how about we try, like the movies that move us from the standpoint of like the box office. And when I tried that, crickets, nothing was, it really didn't show hardly anything. Yeah. But when I tried it on the Oscar nominees, it was like, all of a sudden I saw these, themes that started coming out and then playing out, as the year, unfolded. You started seeing these, it was almost prophetic that these themes were ahead of their time as far as how it would play out in culture.
So I got to stop you there because this is called God an Oscar. You mentioned it's been called several things in the past, but movies, Hollywood, and then God. If you walk into the average church today, that's not, the average priest, pastor, whoever is not going to have that viewpoint, I imagine, that God has much of anything to do with Hollywood today. How is it? So explain to me a little bit how you got to the Best Picture nominees. How could God possibly be speaking through those? Like, I'm looking at this slide here that you've got up, and the first thing is talking about not a fan of parties. Like, how are you saying God and Oscar could be combined if he's not a fan of parties? I mean, this is like...
No, I don't mean it literally. For me, what I'm trying to say is that when we're talking about God and his intersection with these movies, that it's not about the Oscar ceremony. It's not about the party. Like, I'm not saying God endorses, all Hollywood and all these, like blah, blah, blah. To me, it's not about the night that is the party. It's about the art itself. And that's somehow missed in it all, right? Like, I think the reason that what we're doing here is so important is because it's not ever done, right?
Yeah.
Like, there's nobody sitting down and going, let's look at the meaning behind all these movies and how these meanings come together and form a bigger meaning, right? And so for me, I believe God is in the meaning of our lives, is in the meaning of the art. Like, God is an artist. So it's not about the party. It's not about what's going to happen. And who's going to win. It's about the meaning in the movies and how God may actually be in the meaning of the movies and the greater, meaning that when you pull these movies together, what they say.
So if Matt Damon and Jimmy Kimmel get in a fist fight on stage, you're saying that doesn't play a part.
That doesn't
in
have
the
anything
theme?
to do with God. Yeah.
Okay.
Well,
Now
no, I don't think so.
This next one here, Don't Show Me the Money. You were talking a little earlier about how you tried to look at the box office movies, and that was kind of my first question is, we're talking about God speaking through movies.
Yeah.
Why does he care about this particular list of 10 movies versus, Barbie, Oppenheimer, and the 8 other highest grossing movies of the year?
Yeah, totally. So for me, it's whenever you take commerce out of the equation and you do art for art's sake, then it has much more a prophetic nature to it, right? And it's just like every studio usually has a passion project that they're not looking to make money on, but they want to make sure that's the project that they have the opportunity to win an Oscar. And so there are projects that are deliberately made to be Oscar nominees without the concept of money being involved. So for me, that's so important to know that, this is not about, even though Barbie and Oppenheimer were huge hits this year, that this is not about the money. This is about art saying something to us. And because of that, it usually has something more to say.
Right? Art for the sake of art.
Art for the sake of art, and art for the sake of meaning. Again, that when you focus on a passion project of an actor like Bradley Cooper doing Maestro, he's doing it blood, sweat, and tears, learning conducting for a very long time because he has something he wants to say so deeply. Now, again, for the critics out there who would go, well, it's Bradley Cooper and his liberal agenda, and how can that be connected to God? I say, well, that's not what we're looking at. We're not looking at this one movie and this one passion project and what Bradley Cooper's trying to say. We're looking at all these movies and seeing how they connect to one another.
Is that kind of what we're looking at here with this line, supernatural timing? I mean, you mentioned Bradley Cooper and Maestro. He's been working on that thing since A Star Is Born in 2018.
Right.
And Christopher Nolan, on the other hand, feels like he pumps out a movie every 3 years.
Yeah.
Is that kind of...
Yeah, it's amazing when you think of what it takes for a movie to be an Oscar nominee. It's pretty miraculous for these films to come together. The one I think so vividly of is when I saw The Color Purple, and I knew Steven Spielberg was a part of it. I was like, oh, there's no doubt that this is going to be an Oscar nominee. And it wasn't. Like Zone of Interest ended up being in its place, and like Zone of Interest, like who's heard of this? And so it is pretty miraculous the way these films come together. And if you know anything about the making of a film like my film took 8 years to make, from conception to distribution. And so we're talking about people who have things that they want to say that, are way, way back before culture comes to bear, So the supernatural timing that all these movies come together and say something is miraculous, that these films would have any connections to each other is miraculous. And for that, I feel like that's like God going, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you. And the Oscar, board of the Academy's going, no, we're going you. And I think God's going, no, I'm going you, kind of thing.
So that's a big question, because we're talking about God as you and I both understand God. We share a faith.
Yeah.
How and why would he come down into something as small and increasingly irrelevant, it seems, like
That's
the Oscars?
That's a good question. That's the question I've had trust me, that is the question I've had for years, because I've been doing this for 11 years, and I'm like, I'm just shouting in the wilderness, and there's nobody listening. And yet that is, if you look at the prophets of old, that's sort of what they are. They're sort of prophets who are shouting into the wilderness and nobody's listening, And I think that's the nature of being a prophet, the nature of an artist as a prophet.
You're just going to have to explain this one to me, because I have no idea where you're going with this one. You're speaking my language.
Oh, yeah. This is the most important one to me. So I believe that the reason the church doesn't really might not appreciate, like they're not doing sermons on Sunday about the Oscars and God, is because we've lost a sense, especially as a church, of how God is a God who speaks story. I say he speaks motion pictures, which what I mean by that is it's not only story, it's image and it's metaphor. So you take image, metaphor, and story, and you do a Venn diagram of that, and what you have is motion pictures in my mind. And so I believe God is a God who continues, did always reveal himself through those three things. And yet at the same time, we can't cut him off. We can't go, oh, you only did that with your parables, Jesus, in Scripture. No. If this is his language, if God has a language and his language is story, metaphor, imagery, which I call motion pictures, then why in the world would he not use the people who are best at it in the world? Why would he not use that? Why would he not use artists who speak his language of metaphor, image, and story to say something, right? Yeah. That just makes no sense to me. So to me, this is what I mean by the Oscars, is I believe that you're taking the brightest and best artist of our time and saying, hey, these people know how to speak God's language, and so therefore we need to listen because maybe God is revealing himself with the very language he likes to speak.
Whether or not they
know it. That's one of the big things is people like, how can God speak through this? And I'm like, well, he spoke through a donkey. And the Old Testament, he spoke through a lot of things that we would say are not sacred or whatever. And
he knocked a really bad dude straight off his horse, and he went on to write 2/3 of the New Testament.
Yeah, totally. Blinded by the light. And so I would say that this is, what God's in the business of doing. He doesn't necessarily decide he's only going to speak through the holy things of the world. And so you have to have a bigger perspective on God from that standpoint.
That's a lot of information. That's a lot of criteria. And I don't know what you're thinking here, but it's probably similar to what I was thinking the first time that you told me about this, which was, that's really interesting. That's really cool. Might be crazy. Might just be a little insane.
Yeah, and, I don't expect everybody out there to buy into this premise, I think there's probably people who don't believe in God, first of all. I want to be sensitive to that. There's also just the fact that, if I'm wrong, that's fine. I'm not, trying to push this so hard. I do believe that God is being a loving God and kind of helping us to see our story before it rolls out. And even I don't know whether he's helping us see our story or whether he's helping us see his story.
Right.
That is another thing that I'm not quite sure of, really. I do think that whatever's happening is kind of motivated out of love to say, hey, this is coming.
Yeah, this is
coming.
It's not for fortune telling.
No, it's not for fortune telling. Exactly. Yeah. And so yeah, I think if you don't believe in this, it's fine, because art gives us meaning. Artists tend to be prophets, whether it's God prophets or not. In fact, there's the old adage of, is art reflecting or imitating culture? Does culture come first and then art come second? Or does art come first and culture come second? And I think the box office probably is imitating, reflecting, where we are.
Yeah.
And then, but the Oscars are definitely our opportunity to see what's up next, And so whether you believe God's in that or not, fine, that kind of thing.
So we don't have time to dive into all 11 years that you've done this, though, goodness me, that sounds like a great afternoon for me.
Oh, well, I don't know about that.
Give us a high-level overview of the way that you've seen God show up in, the past 11 years. I'm looking at this slide here, and just for clarification's sake, these orange lines, I take it those are elections?
Yes, those are the elections. Yeah, so this is 10 years, what you see right now. The 11th, obviously, is this year. And this is the movies I've been looking at. And I would say the first big, oof, wow, this when I woke up and went, okay, the Oscars are saying something, was definitely whenever I was looking at 2014, 15, and 16 in relationship to each other. So in those years, it seemed like every single movie was like, will we survive? Will we survive? It was a whole lot of survival. I mean, I think probably the best example is like The Martian. When I think of these years, I think of The Martian, will he survive on Mars? And that was sort of our, thing. For a lot of these characters, that was their dramatic question. And that's kind of what I look at each year. I try to figure out what's the common dramatic question that these movies are asking. And then I look at, what is the answer that these movies are giving, the common answer, right?
And just real quick, dramatic question, what does that mean? I'm not a scriptwriter.
Thank you. Very good. Dramatic question, will they kill the shark? Movie?
Jaws.
Yeah, exactly. So that's your dramatic question, is whatever is the main question of the movie, right? The reason we're watching the movie is to figure out the answer to that question. So this year was pretty big because what I saw was, these themes that were coming out year upon year, and then all of a sudden we had this major cultural event that happened. And so what I saw in 2014 was, can we get back to the life that we know? If you remember, we just went through a huge economic bust. It was a major thing in 2010 with the housing market and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And so we didn't know, we were bailing out all these companies. We didn't know whether we were going to survive. And so part of that, yeah.
Sorry to interrupt. There's literally a movie about that in these 3 years.
Right, exactly. Yeah, and so, ultimately we were trying to figure out, will we get back to the life we knew, And then in 2015, I remember Birdman coming out that year, and usually I'll put America as the main character and then go, well, what does it look like with America as the main character? And Birdman was literally a movie about a washed-up superhero, let's say superpower, maybe, that was trying to make a comeback on the stage. And I was like, you can't get more metaphorically cool about that. We were trying to make a comeback on the world stage at the time, and we were kind of this superpower that was trying to come back. And so it was just like things like that I was like, whoa, this is getting really, this is pretty much feels like what's going on.
Yeah.
Right. And then finally in 2016, this was the anti-establishment year. Like Spotlight won this year. It was all about all these institutions being questioned. Spotlight was all about questioning the institution of the Catholic Church, right? And so it was investigating, kind of turning, saying, can we trust the church, and things like that. And each of the movies were sort of in that vein, different aspects of it. And so it was definitely challenging the establishment. Well, what happens in 2016? What happens after all these movies?
Well, gee, Brian, I don't remember.
Yeah, exactly.
It's not like we're
remembering this year. Yeah,
it's not like we talk about it every day of our lives in this country.
Yes. So we have a guy who ran on a platform of Make America Great Again, right? And that was what was going through these Oscars is, can we get back to the life we know? Can we, by the way, in 2015, every single character had a special skill. So if you remember, like American Sniper was, he knows how to shoot well. Alan Turing was, he knows how to do math really well. Selma was, he knows how to speak really well. All of them were, theory of everything. He knows really cosmology really well. Every one of them had special skills.
They're all talents.
Right. And we thought, we at that time thought that there was a guy who was going to come who had a special talent and skill. And when we were thinking about Trump, we thought he had a special business skill. Like he was going to bring that business acumen to America. Right. And so here it is, Trump coming into power, running on these very things. Now, if I told this to the Hollywood producers of any of these films, they'd probably be like, no. I was not a part of that.
Yeah.
And I want to make sure you hear this. Please hear this. Please hear this. Please hear this. I am not saying that God elected Trump, okay? Do not hear that. I'm saying he was loving enough to let us know what was in the soup, what was going on, what was stirring, that brought about this kind of man who came into power.
I really want to see you have that conversation with Adam McKay, the director of The Big Short in 2016.
Right. And this is why I always have to start with this example, because immediately when I use other examples, people are like, oh, that's just that woke agenda, liberal Hollywood, blah, 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 elites and stuff like that.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, let's go back. When you want evidence that Hollywood was not intentionally making these things happen, like there was no conspiracy theory that Hollywood got together and said we're going to make about these themes, and it's going to set the stage for someone like Donald Trump. That would never happen. So
yeah, I'm thinking about 2017 and 2018 and the things that were going on those years. If you had told me that the Oscars were predicting those things, that would probably be my first reaction is, yeah, they're just pushing their agenda, but what you just went through, clearly not. So
yeah,
what did happen in 2017, 2018? What themes were we looking at?
So here we are coming after Trump, right? And immediately the dramatic question shifts. It shifts from can we be a we? Again, why this is so significant is these movies are made prior to Trump. So these movie makers didn't know that we would be a divided nation after Trump, right? And so the dramatic question shifting so dramatically to can we be a we or will we be a we was in itself miraculous, right? Then the answers that started building year over year were pretty amazing. So the first year is that in 2017, we had all these movies that were like, we got to go back to the past. We got to get a proper perspective of our past narrative and even deal with our past sins, right? And so these are movies, Hidden Figures is the most known of this year, but, even movies like, La La Land, or I think Manchester by the Sea, Moonlight, even, a movie like Lion. These are all movies where people are dealing with the past and the present and how they affect each other, And so it was really a year all about that kind of past and present juxtaposition. So all of a sudden that year, we see a whole lot of things. We see Charlottesville that happens.
Gracious.
So we're looking at the past. We're looking at statues. Then we are looking at the Me Too movement, which is all about digging up the sins of all these, leaders past and bringing them out into the open and saying, okay, are we getting a proper narrative of who Harvey Weinstein is?
Yeah,
right?
Considering who was involved in Hollywood before 2017, that is not something that they would have wanted to predict.
Exactly. Totally right. So that was 2017 was, if we're going to be a we, then we've got to look back at our past and we've got to we've got to really look back at our past. And then 2018, it was all about women and women having agency, being the change agents, women being change agents. Yeah. Again, this is, now we go, oh yeah, well of course, we've seen that in culture. And I'm like, no, that wasn't where we were in 2018.
Yeah.
But right after that happened, we had that blue wave in Congress where all these women were elected into Congress, and we started seeing women become change agents. Also, words were a big important thing that year. So it was all about how are we using our words, and then we were having a president who's using his words any way he wants, right? And we had a lot of things on Twitter that canceled people. We've started seeing that idea of cancel culture happening after 2018, right? Yeah. And then if we look at 2019 was all about, the concept of, how do we distribute power? So the idea of, I think Black Panther is my favorite example for this one, of which, you've got to use that vibranium and you got to distribute that vibranium in a way that, is right. And so I saw that this theme of power distribution, and we've seen since that time a whole lot of power distribution from a majority culture to, the minority culture. And so I feel like this is, that was huge. They were like little building blocks that were on top of each other.
Yeah.
Now, again, I want to talk to the critics who would say, is it this liberal woke Hollywood agenda, women and, this idea of we got to go back as America and look at our sins, and isn't this power distribution, all this stuff, isn't that just liberal? And I'm like, no. If you go into these movies were not made for that theme, right? Now, there are movies now that are made for that theme.
Yeah.
But back then, these movies were not made for that theme, but when they came together, they expressed that theme.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
I think it does. I mean, you want to use 2019 as an example. We're looking at movies like, Green Book, Black Panther, and Black Klansman. Yeah, you can say they're all some movies that say something about race, but if you ask the people who make those movies, I think they would tell you they're all talking about something very, very different.
Exactly. And then if you pile on other movies on top of that had nothing to do with race and see how it is really about power distribution, then you start going, oh, it's not just about this particular issue. It might be reflected in culture through that issue, but it wasn't intentional in that way.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I feel like this next one, 2020, that was the year that I had showed up to.
You were there, right?
I was there. That was the first time I saw you give this presentation at formerly known as Pinewood Studios, Trilla Studios, Atlanta,
right.
Georgia. And, you talked about, will we remain a we? And if we were to do that, we would have to test our devotions to one another and see if we were going to be our brothers and sisters' keeper. You literally sat there later that evening and said, I don't know, maybe something's going to happen this year that tests our devotions to one another. And even at the time, I was thinking, okay, yeah, we have an election this year.
Yeah, I thought it was the election too. Yeah.
Someone that night literally said, well, the impeachment trial. And all of our minds were in the political space. And then what happens, 3-4 months after that presentation takes place?
Yeah, it just gave me chills all of a sudden. Yeah. It happened, right? Where we were testing our devotion with each other. We had to test whether we would be our brother and sister's keeper, with mask, with choosing money over people, choosing to shut down our economy, all those things. We had to choose what was going to be our brother's keeper and how we were going to test our devotion, to those things that we held from that standpoint. And even that led to the summer, right? And then it became George Floyd, and then we were testing to see if we were going to be our brother's keeper as far as our race was concerned, and then we get to the election, and it's even more amplified. Of are we going to test to be our brother and sister's keeper from Americans when it comes to democracy, right? So it was a big deal that year where this was loud and proud theme, like prophetically saying, here it comes, and then it came, right?
Yeah. Now, I want to ask you about this next year specifically. This is something that I've kind of wondered about, and I know just from talking with you, you've wrestled with a little bit. 2020, huge year in terms of will we remain a we? That's not subtext in 2020. Yeah. That's on everyone's minds in, health, race, politics, whatever arena. And then we move on to 2021. And 2021 is, I felt, the year when things start to get a little more this was truly subtext.
Yeah.
And so
it's a good way to say it, actually. Yeah.
From 2020 to 2021, and even throughout the past 10, 11 years, how do you merge those? How do you combine those two thoughts of sometimes it's very textual, sometimes it's very subtext?
I love the way you said that. That's really a good way to say it, actually. I would say it the way you just said it, which is sometimes it's text and sometimes it's subtext. But I think the other aspect of it that I've seen that's pretty cool is I've kind of let go a little bit of the idea of, it's coming, that kind of concept. Instead, I actually look at it as Lego bricks, okay, here's a theme from this year that builds upon this and builds upon this. So when we look at those years between 2017 to 2019, we see the building blocks of what's going on as far as how to be a we. That if we're going to be a we, that we've got to look at our past. We've got to allow women to be change agents. We've got to look at our words. We've got to, distribute power. That is ingredients, they're building blocks to, if you want to be a we, this is how you got to be a we. Yeah. And that's the ironic thing is, I don't know if we're successful. I don't know if we answer these questions yes. It doesn't seem like we've answered it yes very much. But it does seem like we are progressing through those themes, And the same way with the years that preceded Trump, you saw them as building blocks, right? Yeah. You saw them stacking on top of each other versus just being like, okay, this is going to happen this year. Does that make sense?
No, I think it does.
So years that are a little more subtle, that don't seem to play out very in 2020. And I like the way you say it. It's like subtextual. I think it's just a little bit of a building block that needs to be in place for this next building block that's coming.
Yeah. So let's talk about the most recent building block, not this year, but the movies, the Best Picture nominees of 2023. Let's take a look at some of those. What did you kind of extrapolate? I mean, I was there. I know the answer, but what did you kind of extrapolate?
Well, I do want to throw in 2022 just because it was one of those textual, not subtextual years.
Yeah.
That year, the theme was, is there a place for us? I think was what I said about that. Is there a place where we can be in us?
Yeah.
And the reason I said that dramatic question because place was so important in that too, and it was. But it was all about marking territory, everybody marking their territory. West Side Story is probably the easiest example of that.
Yeah.
Power of the Dog, just people who are marking their territory, and
almost unanimous that year.
Yeah, and then Ukraine. It was here was somebody actually Russia coming in and marking its territory as the Ukraine, and that war breaks out, and it actually happened while we were doing this. It was happening. When the Oscars were happening. So it was pretty amazing that year it was not like it was even foreshadowing. It was like immediate. It was like, here it is, and here it is, kind of thing.
No, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. So 2023. Yes. So if we look at 2023, these are the movies that were last year. And the theme of last year was, again, can we be a we? It kind of came back again in a strong way. Can we be a we? Although I would say it was more of almost like a little bit doomist, like, can we even be a we? It was sort of the way it felt. And the answer,
is it possible?
Yeah, is it even possible? And I think that's the way people feel a lot, right? And so the answer that these movies had was we had to break through barriers and we had to set up boundaries. So it was all about barriers and boundaries. That was the theme of last year. Now, I thought it was very relational oriented. So these movies were all about relational barriers and relational boundaries that were being set up, And so for me, I thought it was going to play out very much as a post-COVID reaction, that we had spent so much time social distancing. So now this was a loving God saying, hey, you need to break through these relational barriers and start, talking to strangers was my bottom line last year.
Yeah.
And I spent the whole year last year talking to strangers. Because I felt like we needed to set down our phones, which is the boundary part, like that. We needed to set up boundaries as far as I believe technology, and we needed to break through barriers relationally. So I thought this was going to be a year in which we see a whole lot of evidence of how we had to deal with our phones, or how we had to finally deal with, our COVID after effect, and how we had to start breaking through. And I think I love the fact that you said subtextual, but because I think from a subtextual standpoint, we've been doing that. Like, I think this year we have been coming back and breathing again and learning how to stretch muscles of relationship. And we've seen the effects of loneliness. We've seen the effects of what COVID gave us. And so I think we are subtextually we have been working out boundaries and barriers.
All due respect, though, in terms of setting up boundaries, in terms of technology, kind of feels like that's the opposite of what we did over the last year.
Well, it feels like it's the opposite, but I think that's what we wrestled with. So I don't think it's necessarily, we may not do the thing that the Oscar says, but we may have to wrestle with the thing, right?
Yeah.
And so if we look at the first thing we dealt with the most last year, the biggest story, I think, it was AI, right? And so how you have something that's breaking a barrier, right? Science is breaking a barrier that we were like, holy crap, it can do this.
Yeah.
Like all of a sudden we're doing Chat GPT and we're like, whoa, I didn't know that was happening so fast.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden we said, okay, we got to set up some boundaries for this, right? All of a sudden we're having, meetings in Congress. We're like, oh, wait. We need to talk to you guys. What are we creating here? That kind of thing.
Yeah.
And so that was definitely, barriers and boundaries as far as that was concerned. We had I think this is more superficial, but, we had a Russian, it's China.
The Chinese spy balloon.
Chinese spy balloon that was like, okay, it's breaking a barrier. We had a submarine that was kind of lost at sea that was like, okay, this, it's, I don't know. That's kind of a stretch for me about, I remember someone called me up and said, this is barriers and boundaries with the submarine. And I was like, oh, okay, yeah, I guess so. And then we had to deal a lot with remote work this year. So we had to deal with sort of the barriers of, dealing with that relational aspect of, do we break through barriers and require people to come back to work? Do we let them remote work, and is there boundaries we need to set with that? So that's been a continued conversation, I think. We had a lot of mass shootings this year, and so we were wrestling with the barriers that was, the barriers that we've always dealt with gun rights as far as barriers and boundaries, right? And then probably one of the bigger ones was, here you have not Ukraine, you're having Israel and Palestine, and so you have a literal border.
Yeah.
And, and that border that barrier, I'd say, being broken through, and then being broken through on the other side, and what are the boundaries even of how we as America should be standing up or not standing up to this,
Yeah.
So it literally has been a little bit of a dance between barriers and boundaries from that standpoint.
Yeah. And I'm glad you mentioned earlier that the thing that you usually do when looking at these dramatic questions, these themes, is putting America in the main character role, because the war in Ukraine, some of these more like international stories, it's kind of about for America, it's finding our place in it.
Yeah.
And I know that has definitely been something we've been wrestling a lot with over the past couple months.
Right.
One thing that I did want to bring up that just kind of came to my mind in terms of barriers and boundaries relationally, this was kind of a year when Hollywood itself was a story because the dual WGA and SAG-AFTRA strikes, as well as other labor unions around the country.
That's good.
Had the rail workers.
That's good. Yeah. So I'm interrupted. Go.
No,
that's good. That's good.
That's what I saw.
No, well, you're talking about strike line, which is a barrier and a boundary at the same time, right?
The answer is no. These two groups that would not typically talk to one another have to sit at a table together. And you want to talk about the building blocks there of the last time a dual WGA and SAG-AFTRA strike happened. The president was Ronald Reagan. No, I'm sorry. The president of SAG-AFTRA was Ronald Reagan.
How about that?
And this year, Fran Drescher is, we have a woman in leadership talking about. I'm rambling here. Interrupt me, please.
No, it's good. I think you're getting right to the point, which is, you're physically seeing a strike line, which ends up being both a barrier and a boundary at the same time, depending on what side you're on, right?
Yeah.
So this is the way these themes played out in culture in my brain, although I thought it was not going to be this way. I thought it was just going to be, we're post-COVID, we're going to have a whole lot of discussions, something's going to happen that makes us realize we need to put our phones down and start talking to each other. And I think there's been more science to that, and I think there's been more discussion about that over the last year than it ever has been before.
There's a technological aspect for sure between the AI, the Chinese spy balloon, remote work, the Titan submersible. All of these things are questions of where are we going to allow technology to take us?
Where are we going to set up that boundary while it's breaking barriers? Yeah. Right? It's good. All right, so you ready?
2024, let's take a look.
So here comes the slide of the 2024 Oscar nominees. What did they say to us, or what did they reveal this year? So here's our nominees. You want to dive into it?
Absolutely. Let's see what the theme for this year is.
Okay, so when we look at this year's Oscars, I usually do it in bubbles. So you've probably seen this before, where I kind of go, okay, how many movies say this? How many movies say this? And then I usually bring the biggest bubble is the one that says most of the movies say this, right? Yeah. So when it comes, this year I decided not to just do here is the least amount. I wanted to kind of bring them together a little bit. So one of the first things is you see a lot of American legends. And Oppenheimer's one of those, right?
Tell me Barbie is also
on this list. Is also on this list, right?
American legend.
She's an American legend. And then you have a movie like Killers of the Flower Moon, which there's no American legends in it, but it was a legendary story of the Osage people. Yeah. And then you have in Maestro, you have Bernstein as an American legend also. So that was one of the first themes I began to see. There's a lot of trials and judgment, literal trials in the movies.
Yeah.
You have that in Anatomy of the Fall for sure.
For sure.
You have that with Oppenheimer. He's on trial pretty much the whole movie, as well as his nemesis is on kind of not really trial, but it's sort of that's why I put judgment, because there's a whole lot of people sitting in judgment,
Yeah.
Even at the end with of Killers of the Flower Moon.
Oh, for sure.
There's the judgment of Ernest, our poor character. Yeah. I don't know if he's so poor, but anyway, our character who's done a lot. So just a lot of trials, not a lot, but it was in there. And then there's a theme that's am I a monster? And monster may be a little bit too big of a word, but it literally was said in dialogue, like in Anatomy of Fall.
Yeah.
It's,
I'm not a monster.
Is she a monster? Did she actually cause this? We look at Oppenheimer, and I think Oppenheimer is dealing and wrestling with, am I a monster? Did I unleash this, and am I a monster because of it? In Poor Things, you're dealing with Bella, who literally is a Frankenstein monster, that's been created, and is she a monster? Into the world. So there's several movies where the concept of do people perceive me as a monster? Do I perceive myself as a monster? And that kind of leads into this bigger theme that's there. That's why I kind of wanted to bring them all together.
Yeah.
Is perception and others' perception, right?
Yeah. Man, that plays into Barbie so much.
Right? Yeah. Tell me how you see that.
I mean, I see it in the, Barbie's moment of crisis is her thinking that she doesn't really have a place in the world. She's stereotypical
Barbie, right?
And does not have a thing,
Right, exactly. So others' perception is what she perceives herself is I'm supposed to hold up this stereotypical Barbie thing.
Yeah.
And so then, that's what's the wrestling match in the movie is that perception that even she has of herself and others have of her, right?
You're describing something stereotypical. Barbie is so much more than that.
Look at yourself.
I am technically stereotypical Barbie.
You set the feminist movement back 50 years. You destroy girls' innate sense of worth, and you are killing the planet with your glorification of rampant consumerism.
No, I'm supposed to help you.
Yeah. But that plays into so many movies as far as people's perceptions of others.
You need to start seeing yourself the way others are going to perceive you.
He can be the first great American conductor.
Now, most of the kids dislike you, pretty much hate you. Teachers, too. You know that, right?
The reason I put all these together is you can see how they all fit together. Like if you're an American legend and how you're perceived, are you perceived is Oppenheimer perceived as an American legend, or is he perceived as an American monster? Those things, and that trial and judgment is all a part of that perception. I'm putting you on trial to see what the perception right or wrong. So even a movie like American Fiction, right? American Fiction is all about the perception that that people have that he's this thug kind of, like he has to live into this perception that others have, like he is this writer who's been in prison.
You said that, not me.
And then he's dealing with perceptions, right? He's dealing with that representation I talked about earlier of how am I representing myself? What is others' perception of me? What's the perception I should have of myself?
This is you. No, it's not, Arthur.
Yeah.
And so all of those things are playing into, movies this year.
Yeah, absolutely.
You even have a movie like Zone of Interest, which is about a family who's living right next to Auschwitz. I feel like I'm saying that wrong every time I say it. The Nazi camp. And they're living a normal life, and it's the guy who goes to work every day and he's, doing all these horrible evils, right? So he is a monster. And it's very much a cautionary tale where it's like, usually with movies that are cautionary tales where it's like, okay, this is what we don't want to be. You can always flip it and go, okay, there's not a question here. He is a monster, right?
Yeah.
But you do have to deal with the perception of, is this just a guy who's going to work and taking care of his family? Or is he literally a monster? I mean, obviously he is. And so that wrestling is happening even in that movie.
Right.
So next, we definitely see worlds being a part of this. Now, I always am cautious with this because, most movies have worlds. I mean, it's not like, whoa, that's a big theme. But I do think there's a certain thing where, like when we dealt with the year that it was all about territorialism, there was a sense in which territories, like people marking their territories where it was a big deal. In this year, there's a whole lot of like place significance. Like just think of Barbie Land.
Yeah.
Like it's a significant part of the movie, right? Barbie Land, real world. Like these are two significant places that shape the story, right?
Heck, even Los Alamos in Oppenheimer.
Correct.
There's a big discussion about, can anyone who worked in Los Alamos be trusted because they're all under the cult of Oppie?
Yeah. And then you go to like, I was just talking about Zone of Interest, right? Place is significant. There's a family right next to this Nazi killing camp, So, place is pretty significant within it. Osage County, it's about Osage County. It's about these Native Americans who live in Osage County, very much sort of place centric. Even a movie like Holdovers, which you loved, right? Like that movie is so significant when it comes to the place of the college that we're set in, right?
Yeah.
That we really, the story unfolds because that college is so important to the plot of the story. It's not just, we're here in this world, right?
And even the place that they're trying to get to is a big, like, there's so many questions around it, as well as such significance to the character's story.
Yeah. All right, so then we look at, I called it male insecurity, is what I called it. You know, you could call it toxic masculinity, but I'm going to call it male insecurity. You obviously see it in Barbie with with Ken, right? Embracing patriarchy, right?
That amazing musical number.
Right.
I'm just Ken.
But, you know, really what you're dealing with that is just male insecurity, right?
Out there, I was somebody. And when I walked down the street, people respected me just for who I am.
There's a lot of men who are just really, if you go to Poor Things, you know, the whole movie has a very insecure character who used to be the Hulk. Gosh, why is
Mark Ruffalo?
Mark Ruffalo, yeah, like his character is so insecure the whole movie, right? Trying to just bring his dominance over the main female character. But it's really about insecurity. Ernest in Killers of the Flower Moon is like such an insecure male, right? He's trying to do all this stuff, you know, that his uncle wants him to do. And then, you know, at the same time, he's trying to love a woman. And you just see that male insecurity in it all. So that's in there. And then the next one is you see couples. So there are a lot of couples. So the reason I bring this up is that in another year, you might see like La La Land, where it's, will these two people come together, you know, or something like that. Yeah. Like there's a lot of, you know, like we in it all. In these movies is sort of an I in the we.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. In previous years, there's the question of will they, won't they? But this year, you know, everyone in these movies, it's pretty much already a they, but it's a question of what does an outside observer see? I mean, Past Lives opens with it.
Yeah, Past Lives is the closest to being a love story that's like, will they get together, right? But in reality, it's really about them defining themselves in the context of that relationship, right?
I feel so not Korean when I'm with him, but also in some way more Korean.
That you know they're not going to get together because, sorry, spoiler alert, she's married. But what's happening in that traditional love story is them defining themselves, right? Them going, their individuality is being expressed in the aspect of being a couple, right? Yeah. And you see this with most of the films. Even Ken and Barbie, like, you're really not like, I mean, I was kind of reading that Ken and Barbie would get together at the end, but it's really not the story. Like, it's not a love story about Ken and Barbie.
Yeah.
It's about them, and it ends that way, where it's about them finding their individuality inside of being a couple.
Maybe it's Barbie and it's Ken.
Ken is me.
I have to ask, with all of these different bubbles, the closest that we get to all of them sharing one thing, which already, let's point out, is kind of incredible considering we have movies that run the gamut from biopic to science fiction, toy merchandise movies, courtroom dramas. Is there anything that all of these things share?
All right, we're coming to it. So the last two, I would say that it comes up most, and obviously the biggest one is shared by all 10, is this idea of self-actualization and self-liberation. And I kind of came up with the term that I believe is in all of them, which is self-definition. Trying to figure out, who am I? I especially wanted to do self-definition in relationship to Oppenheimer because I feel like he's trying to define himself. It's not really self-actualization with him. Yeah. It's not really, it's sort of self-liberation a little bit. Like I think he is trying to liberate himself from what he's created. But I think it's more of a self-definition saying, how am I, like I think that he goes through that whole kangaroo court in the movie to define himself.
Yeah, it's the opening line, the first spoken line. Some of the first spoken lines are, you can only understand my life's work in the context of my entire life.
Right, exactly. And so, if probably the one movie that people have seen the most is Barbie, right? That is a movie about self-definition, right? It is a little bit about self-actualization. It is a little bit about self-liberation. But I think what's happening really is this definition of self. Like, who am I really? What's the truth about me? That aspect of things. Even movies like Anatomy of the Fall, we're trying to define, like, who is this woman? And what is who is she really? Is she a monster, or is she, a mother? Like, defining herself.
Yeah.
And every single one of these movies, you see that. Even with a movie like Maestro, where it's, he's defining himself throughout the course of, his sexual orientation in relationship to his marriage and everything like that. Is all self-definition, right?
Yeah.
Even though it's a movie about him being a maestro, it's still really about a movie about him defining himself.
Yeah, I don't hear a lot of we in these movies.
Nope. It is not a whole lot of we. It's a whole lot of I, and it's an I in the we. If there's a we, there's an I in the we. Just like we talked about past lives. It's a woman moving from Korea, right, to America, and then defining herself in America. And then her former childhood, love interest coming to America to help define himself in relationship to what he remembered about her.
Yeah.
And her trying to define herself in relationship to what he represents about her culture and what he represents about who she wants to be now as an immigrant to America, right?
Yeah.
So a whole lot of self-definition there. Even in Killers of the Flower Moon, you're seeing Ernest trying to define himself, but I believe it's more about his Osage wife, I forget her name all of a sudden.
Molly.
Molly, yes, Molly, who's trying to define herself. Like, how much am I going to let these people abuse us, and how long? And even with my own husband, and how much am I defining my own self in this process? So definitely see that. And then American Fiction, you see, I can go through all of them, and all of them do have this sense of self-definition. American Fiction, he's trying to define himself as a black man, right? He's trying to define himself as an author, writing, whatever he wants to write, and how that reflects who he is, right? Even The Holdovers, I feel like, is self-definition, because what happens in the end. He's defining himself in the end as to who he is, and he's misperceived at the beginning. So when you see all these coming together, you see how perception plays into definition, right?
For sure.
You see how judgment plays into definition. You see how being a legend plays into definition.
Now, all of that is super interesting, and like, you're right, all of those movies have a current through them of not only what does this character mean to another character, but also what does this character mean to the person watching the movie. Like Barbie, Oppenheimer, Past Lives, Killers of the Flower Moon, American Fiction. There's so many movies where the viewer is involved, and honest to goodness, I have no idea where I'm going with that. I'm just really interested to see what the big question is.
I think
all of this.
I think one of the things that, when you say that, the thing that comes to my brain is how many of these movies you get that close up. Like, if you watch even the trailer of Oppenheimer, there's just these large close-ups of him thinking, right?
Yeah.
And if you watch Barbie, even the trailer of Barbie, it's that moment where she's like, does anybody else think about death? And you zoom in to her thinking, right? For the first time. And, we didn't mention Poor Things, but Poor Things is all about this, childlike Frankenstein woman who goes out into the world to explore and figure out who she is, right? It's totally, the whole movie is self-definition, right? But those movies, you're going to see that classic zoom, or even not zoom in. It's just like present throughout the whole movie of, like, this is what I'm thinking about myself, and who am I? That kind of close-up, right? Extreme close-up even. And again, if you look at Zone of Interest, it's always going to be the opposite. It's a person who's not defining themselves. It's a person who is not, taking the time to think about who they are. Instead, they're tone deaf. They're turning a blind eye, right?
They're detached to the point where their detachment is the point.
Is the point, right? Yeah, exactly. And so they're not being self-reflective. And that is the problem, right? And so you even see the reverse of self-definition in a movie like Zone of Interest.
Yeah, that's super interesting stuff.
Yep.
Gosh, Brian, can we please just get to the question? I'm dying here.
All right, here comes the question. So I think based on all of this, the dramatic question for us this year is nothing to do with we. It's not can we be a we, which is kind of a little bit, we've been doing that for a while. And we've seen in our culture that we are divided. And I don't know if the question's over or, we've answered it. No, I don't know. But the question for this year is how do I define and or redefine myself? Okay.
Yeah. No, this is super interesting. How do I define and or redefine myself?
Yeah.
I want to come back to something that you had mentioned earlier when you were talking about how you put America in the main character role with these dramatic questions. What we're talking about here is God in the Oscars. So I almost wonder, is this, and not to get too behind the curtains, but we've talked before about, is this America or is this the American church?
Totally a good thing, man. I didn't even prompt you for that. That was really good. Yeah, I think this year's theme in question is really important for the American church. Like, I think defining and redefining ourselves as a church is hugely important. Like, I think one of the things, just personally, this is a rant, is I think after COVID, like COVID gave us an opportunity to see how we were doing church. I think God was going, hey, this is an inciting incident. Like, I don't want you to go back to the way you were doing it before. And what did we do? We went back exactly to the way we were doing it before, with a little live stream over here, right? And so I think this is definitely a call to the church in America to say, how are we defined? How do we need to define? It's a self-reflective moment.
Yeah.
How are we as a church self-reflecting and saying, what's our definition? How do we want to be defined? How can we redefine ourselves, So yeah, thanks for bringing that up, because I would have forgotten that. But I think this is a special message that God might be saying to the church only, or it might be, again, I can't predict it. It's not fortune telling. So, but you can see how an election year is going to define us again. We're going to be defined, and it's ironic, isn't it?
Is it?
Yeah, isn't it ironic that everybody's so frustrated that we're getting the same thing again, like we're getting Trump and Biden, right? Yeah. And isn't that ironic? Because it sounds like our heart's cry is we want to redefine ourselves.
Yeah.
We don't want to define ourselves by these two choices again, right? Yeah. So I don't know what that means. Yeah. I don't know if there's a third party candidate. I don't know what this means at all.
Yeah.
But I do believe that this is probably a year, if not this year, then we're trying to define and redefine ourselves. And who knows whether it's at home, globally, you never know what's going to happen in this next year. I've often, the last thing I'll say is NATO is becoming such a big deal right now. And I feel like that's a definition that is coming up more and more, is like, how are we defined by our relationships with NATO? And do we need to redefine that at all? I'm not saying we do. I'm just saying that that's becoming an issue. Yeah. And then if you put that building block of last year of barriers and boundaries, like how you can start to see some Lego blocks coming into play. So
you mentioned two things there, the relationship with NATO and the Lego blocks. I feel like that question of how are we going to redefine our relationship with NATO? Like, I feel like you could have cut that question off at how are we going to redefine our relationships? Just period.
Period, globally, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then also, it's so interesting looking at this question among all of the other themes throughout the past couple of years, because, we look back at 2017 of getting a better look at our past and redefining our narrative. There's literally, some of the questions that came up that year in the bubbles this year of are we monsters? And if so, how do we define or redefine ourselves?
Yeah, the difference is, that year was so heavily contrasting present and past, right? Like there was just a really big contrast. The only movie that's sort of like that in this bunch, which goes to show you how you have to kind of dive into it for the specificity of whatever it is this year, right? Yeah. Whatever these movies bring you. Because I could easily push that agenda on it and say, well, once again, these movies are talking about the past and how we got to do it. But really, that's only past lives and I would say probably The Holdovers. Those two movies dig in a little bit to it's the contrast between what we were, what we used to be, and what we are now. And so it's not fair for me to go, well, that's a theme here when I only see it in like 2 movies, really.
Yeah.
Versus seeing it in all the movies, or seeing it in majority of movies. So not to undercut what you're saying, I think you're right in the fact that, we dealt with a definition of ourselves, or we're still dealing with a definition of ourselves based on our past.
Yeah.
This seems to be more of the reason I put how, because I could have put can we define ourselves and redefine ourselves. But I put how because I believe the movies are all about characters going on a journey of that self-definition. It's more about, the movies are more about how does Barbie become human? Like how does, or what is she, how is she defining herself the whole movie, right? And so it's more about the how than it is of can she define herself? Yeah, I think she's going to, right?
Yeah.
So
that's a seismic shift in questions in and of itself. It's
right.
It's not a yes or no. It's a how.
Yeah, exactly. Like what's going to happen. So that is, I think, going to play maybe into this year, or maybe that's sort of the foreshadowing that God's giving us, is we're going to deal with a how in relationship to definition, versus just can we. Like you were talking about earlier with the church, like can we define ourselves and redefine ourselves? Maybe, I don't know, but that's not really the question. The question more is how do we define or redefine ourselves?
Yeah.
All right, so you ready for the answers that these movies give?
I'm pretty curious about this.
Else you wouldn't be in the chair, right?
That's fair.
So to define and or redefine myself, I must, and of course we could say it more in the global I, which is, like I as America or I as the church, I must step out of the role I have in my world to free myself to become more human and fully me.
Yeah, that's a wide-ranging, just casually become more human and fully me. Which of the movies here does that answer come through loudest in?
Oh gosh, I think this one is loudest in Barbie, actually, don't you? I mean, she
literally
has to step out of Barbie land. She has to step out of her role as stereotypical Barbie, right? And she has to free herself to become human.
Yeah.
Like as literally, she's becoming human and become more fully her. So to me, this is, straight on Barbie.
Yeah.
But it is a lot of the other movies too. It is the concept of let's do The Holdovers, because that one may be like The Holdovers. And I go, yeah, that's The Holdovers. Because at the end of the movie, he has to step out of his role as the professor.
Yeah.
And he has to free himself up, to become more human, because at the beginning he's definitely not more human, right?
Oh yeah.
He becomes more human as the movie, as you step into the movie and become more fully himself,
Yeah.
So it's The Holdovers also, as well as Barbie. It is, obviously if we do the opposite with Zone of Interest, this is what he doesn't do. He doesn't step out of his role. He doesn't step out of that world.
Yeah.
To be more human. Right,
he just accepts it.
Right, he's less. He's not human because he doesn't do that. Right,
yeah,
and he's not fully himself because he does that.
So I'm so glad you asked how instead of can, because even with Barbie, yeah, she steps out of her role to become literally more fully human, and also she has a conversation with someone who says, "I can't, in good conscience, let you do that without understanding the gravity, the weight of what it is to be human."
Of being human. And you have that nice montage of what humanity looks like, that's so beautiful with its tears and with its joy and everything like that. And that's where I really feel like that's so strong. And that's what I feel like is so strong for the church too. I think part of the church is we got to become more fully human. We've got to do what Barbie did. Is really there's our bumper sticker for the church. Do what Barbie did.
You heard it here first. Coming to every sermon by your preacher, pastor this year is be more
Barbie.
like Barbie.
Yeah,
WWBD.
Yeah, exactly.
So what's the next one here?
All right, the next one is we have to overturn the perception of others. I purposely used the word overturn the perception of others because there were so many trials, there were so many judgments. And so that one was, you obviously saw one of the bubbles being perception as a big deal. In the last one we just did, you saw worlds and places being a big deal. I'll go back to that one just for a second. I'm sorry.
Please, yeah.
Poor Things. I would be remiss if I didn't say that Poor Things was definitely about a person stepping out into a new world and figuring out how to liberate herself in order to be fully human and to be fully herself. So even though it's Barbie, it's like dead on Poor Things also, you know. Yeah. So this next one, though, of overturning the perception of others, I feel like this is definitely Oppenheimer for sure. I feel like it's definitely Anatomy of the Fall for sure, you know.
Yeah. Stop. I did not kill him.
I like the word overturn because these characters are very active in trying to overturn what the perception is.
Yeah.
Like Oppenheimer walks in to this kangaroo court knowing it's a kangaroo court because he wants to overturn that perception.
Is anyone ever going to tell the truth about what's happening here?
You look at, you know, a movie like American Fiction, and you see a person trying to overturn the perception that others have, you know, of what it means for him to be black. So that's another big theme of how we define or redefine ourselves, is to overturn the perceptions of others. I still think it's, and maybe it's not the words yet. I like overturn because I feel like it's very active, but I do think it's like walking into the enemy's jaws, if that makes sense. Like, you know, you think of Anatomy of the Fall, and she's walking into that crate. I didn't know French people did that kind of.
Oh, it's chaos.
It's weird.
Watch
the movie for the sake of how, you know, France does its judicial system is very interesting. But she walks into it, you know, as a lion, as a lamb coming to the lion. And so I do think there's something there about, even though that perception is wrong, even though the truth is going to be messed with a little bit, or there's, you know, is stacked against us, we're willing to walk into that to change others' perceptions as well as, you know, define ourselves, you know. Like, I think we could, let me say it better. Like, you can define yourself by just going, here I am, here's who I am, that kind of stuff. And you never deal with the naysayers. You never deal with the people who are trying to cancel you. Like, this might have something to do with culture. We are so divided as a country right now that we don't want to go into the enemy's jaws, right? We don't want to go in and try to change people's perception because we're like, well, it's never going to help, you know. It's all rigged. It's an echo chamber over here. It's an echo chamber over here, right? But there is few people who actually go, I'm going to walk right into that and, you know, try to define myself in the midst of it.
So what's the last? I see some space here. It looks a little bit like a third.
There's one more, yes. So here comes the third one. The third one is that we have to come to terms with the part I played. So you have to come to terms with the part I played. And again, this is in reference to the question of how do we define or redefine ourselves, that we must come to terms with the part that we played. So this might sound a little bit like you were talking about with 2017, like the part we played in the past.
Right.
I think it's more present than that. You know, if you think of Oppenheimer, it's not like he's going back and go, what part did I play way back here yonder when I made the atom bomb? It's not like really that. It's like
it's instant.
It's pretty instantaneously, you know, like we are watching time. We were watching 3 segments of time that Nolan does so brilliantly, but it's not like, let's go back to slavery and look at what happened in slavery. You know, it's like, let's go back to, you know, like moments before when we made this atomic bomb, right?
Yeah.
And so I think, you know, obviously AI, we talked about that concept of barriers and boundaries, you know, and the idea of, you said that it was, Oppenheimer was playing right at the time that AI was coming out, and we were going, have we created a monster here? And can we put the Pandora back in the box, you know? And so I think there is the wrestling with the accountability to what did we just create, you know? And so I still think that's present in these movies, is that there is that sense of, you know, what did we just do? You know, what just happened?
Yeah.
And this just happened to us. What are we going to do about it? You know, now, like, what are we going to do about it?
Even something as lighthearted as Barbie, you know, there's still a moment between her and Ken when she says, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have treated you that way. This isn't like, you know, you're right. It's instant.
Yeah. And I think, you know, there is, I mean, I think Oppenheimer is probably the best example of this, but there is several movies where you're wrestling with what is my role, what how did I play a part in that? Even in Anatomy of the Fall, we get to see whether she's innocent or not at the end, but we still are wrestling throughout the whole movie of, well, what did happen in their marriage? Like, what was going on? What part was she playing in that? And so there's definitely that. In American fiction, you have to deal with the part that he does play in putting out this book that does play into stereotypes, and him wrestling with what part am I playing in propagating these stereotypes or undercutting these stereotypes. So.
No, that's pretty interesting.
Yeah. There they are.
Well, that's awesome.
So those are the three answers. Again, I look at this and I go, I don't know how in the world, what is going to happen here. I don't have even a guess. Last year, I thought I had a pretty good guess. This year, I don't have anything. I don't know. Do you have, when you look at this, do you see something that goes, oh, okay, I see this coming. I see how the election will play into this, that kind of thing.
The thing is here, I don't really see anything that could be coming down the line here. But the thing that's so interesting to me about this is the same thing that last year's topic. The reason why last year's topic was so interesting to me is because it goes back to It goes back to the way you phrase this here: to define and or redefine myself, I must.
Yeah.
Because maybe this will play out.
Yeah.
Maybe this will play out in an obvious textual way.
Yeah.
Maybe it'll be more subtext when it comes to putting America in the eye.
Yes.
Or the church in the eye.
Yes.
But for me, when I read these, it's almost like a guidepost here. I have these things to think about as I'm going throughout the year, as I'm making decisions, existing in the world. And it's just something that I can come back to and almost kind of use as a question to keep asking myself.
You bring up a really great point, Chris. And that is, I've often asked myself, why am I still doing this? Is anybody even watching this right now? Does anybody care? Is anybody still watching this right now? That kind of thing. And so, but I can tell you this, that because of the Oscars, it's changed my life, right? Mm. Every year upon year, I have guided my life as if God was speaking through them to me, right? Yeah. And so last year, I really did seek to break down barriers between relationally. So if I was sitting at Great Clips, which tells you where this fine haircut came from.
The Oscar salon.
Yeah, the Oscar salon. Yeah, it wasn't that. I would sit there and I'd watch everybody on their phone as they're waiting for their haircut. And I would put my phone down and I would try to engage in a conversation with a stranger. And it was the most joyful year because I began to see, and maybe it's just because I'm an introvert, but I began to see how powerfully transformative that was in my life to begin to break down those barriers and talk to strangers. So it changed me. And I looked at those boundaries too of, how my phone, I needed to create more boundaries with my phone, social media, blah, blah, blah. But even more than that, even things that didn't have to do with technology. Yeah. But I do think you're right that at the end of the day, whether this happens in America, whether this happens in the world, whether this happens in technology and science and all this kind of stuff, is not as impactful as if you live this yourself. So if you think of the I as you as the I and say, I need to do some defining and redefining of myself this year. Let me get on what God wants, what God's doing in the world.
Bigger and smaller.
Right, exactly. So if he's in this big world doing these small things, right, that are, that can be personal. And so how do I define or redefine myself? And to do that, how can I step outside of some of my roles that I have and be more free to be more human, be more fully myself? How can I do that? How can I walk into the perception of others, How can I do that, whatever that perception is? And then how can I ultimately look at the part that I've played in whatever it is that I've created maybe? Maybe it's just in my own creations, being more cognizant of when I create something going, oh, well, what is my role in that? Or what is the terms in which I need to say I played a part in whatever I create, So those are some of the things that I can look at from a personal perspective as I seek to define. I also like what you said about the church, because I do think this is a recipe for the church, right? I mean, it looks pretty spot on as a good recipe, which I think the church needs to step out of the role that they have in their world, you know. And I think the church needs to become more fully themselves and fully human. I think the church needs to overturn the perception of others. I think the church needs to look at the part, or to come to terms with the, you know, the part that they've played in whatever they've created.
Yeah.
You know? So I do think this is a pretty strong recipe if you were looking at a roadmap for the church this year, or for further years even. So
that's good stuff.
Bryan, so here we are. Yep.
This has been great. Thank you so much for walking us through all of this. Thank you
for
a
lot. I'm
including
sorry.
me in this. This is awesome.
Thank you,
been
bud.
Great.
Yeah. Ooh, we shook hands.
Is this weird?
It's kind of weird, but
it's kind of weird.
I like it though. Go ahead.
Well, this has been great. This has been super fun. Bryan, if people want to know more about what you do at Real Experiences.
Oh, wow. You're setting me up for a commercial. That's
absolutely. Good. Where should they go? What should they look into?
Okay. If you're going to do it, say it that way. Yeah, so Real Experiences is REEL experiences.com. And yeah, we would love to have your team, have your, usually we do teams right now, corporate teams. Any kind of team, really, staffs, anything like that, that we get you together, we look at your favorite movies, and we do almost like what we've done here with the Oscars, where we look inside of them and look for those common themes, common desires, common questions, common answers to your story and what your story is. And I equally believe that God is involved in that too, and is involved in, again, he's big, and yet he's small, in being able to reach down and say, here's Dumb and Dumber, and now you're crying over Dumb and Dumber in relationship to some other movie on your top 10, right? So thank you guys for watching, and we'll see you next year.
Have a good one.